China doesn't need Greenland. That's the part that makes this whole spectacle so dangerous. Because President Trump is threatening tariffs against European allies, floating military force, and repeating one core justification on loop: we have to take Greenland before China does. And it sounds, on the surface, like classic national security logic. Strategic island, Arctic routes, rare earths, missile defense. But once you follow the actual mechanics, shipping geography, mineral processing choke points, alliance cohesion, and the psychology of coercion, the Greenland push starts to look like a strategic gift to Beijing. Not because Greenland is worthless, it's because the way Washington is pursuing it could deliver China something far more valuable than a frozen island. Stay with me, because later in this video, I'm going to show you the real choke point behind the rare earth story, why owning the rock is not the same as owning the leverage, and why Trump's Greenland strategy risks fracturing NATO in a way China has tried and failed to do for years. And then we're going to close with the one approach that would actually counter China in the Arctic without torching America's credibility. Welcome back to the Dollar Watch. We cover the hidden economy of power, where resources, alliances, capital flows, and coercion collide. If you want analysis that isn't packaged for cable news, subscribe. This issue is moving fast, and the downstream consequences won't be contained to the Arctic. They will hit your economy, your security posture, and your cost structure. Now let's be fair and establish what's real about Greenland's strategic value, because the pro-Greenland argument isn't imaginary. Greenland is positioned in one of the most consequential corridors on the planet. It sits between North America and Europe, adjacent to the Geopolitical Gap, Greenland, Iceland, United Kingdom, the maritime and air corridor that mattered intensely during the Cold War for tracking Soviet submarines and protecting the North Atlantic. In a world of renewed great power competition, those geographies don't stop mattering. If anything, they matter more, because modern warfare is not only tanks and troops, it's undersea cables, missile trajectories, submarine routes, space surveillance, early warning systems. And Greenland already hosts a core piece of American military infrastructure: Patuxent Space Base, formerly Thule Air Base, an installation tied into missile warning, space domain awareness, and the architecture of American deterrence. The United States has operated there for decades under agreements with Denmark. That matters. It's not hypothetical. It's real capability. Then there are minerals. Greenland holds significant rare earth element deposits, including heavy rare earths, materials like dysprosium and terbium that are crucial for high-performance magnets used in electric motors, wind turbines, and military systems. If you're worried about supply chain security, rare earths are not a niche. They are embedded in everything from precision-guided munitions to the electrification of transport. Finally, the Arctic itself is changing. Ice retreat is opening seasonal windows, and eventually, potentially more reliable windows, for northern shipping routes. Those routes can cut transit time between Asia and Europe compared to traditional paths like Suez. Every strategist understands the implication. New corridors alter naval logistics, trade flows, and the value of territory. So yes, the map matters, the base matters, the minerals matter, the routes matter. Now here's the pivot. None of those facts automatically support the conclusion that the United States must own Greenland to counter China. That's the leap. That's where the logic breaks. And if you're serious about strategy, you don't confuse important with must be annexed. Let's start with the rare earth argument, because it's the one that sounds most persuasive to ordinary voters. The story goes like this: China dominates rare earths. Greenland has rare earths. Therefore, America must take Greenland. That story is neat. It's also incomplete to the point of being misleading. First, rare earths are not rare in the way people assume. They are distributed. The United States itself has meaningful reserves. Greenland's deposits are significant, but the United States is not a rare earth desert. The scarcity is not primarily geological. It's industrial. The real choke point is processing. Rare earths are a category of elements that are difficult to separate and refine into usable, high-purity forms. The separation process is chemically complex, capital-intensive, and environmentally messy. Tailings, acids, waste streams, regulatory burdens, local opposition. And for decades, Western nations effectively chose to outsource that mess. China did the opposite. China built the processing ecosystem. It subsidized, it scaled, it created an industrial moat, not because it had all the ore, but because it chose to control the midstream. This is not a new story. If you want a historical parallel, look at oil. Crude in the ground does not equal gasoline in the tank. The refinery is the gate. In rare earths, separation and refinement are the gate, and China owns a dominant share of those gates. So here's the uncomfortable question you should be asking. If the United States acquired Greenland tomorrow and started mining immediately, which itself is a fantasy timeline, where would the raw material go for processing? Because unless you build a full alternative separation chain, a lot of it still routes through Chinese capacity, or Chinese influence capacity. Owning the ore without owning the processing is like owning a wheat field in a world where your rival controls every flour mill. That's why industry experts who actually understand the supply chain often describe the Greenland solves rare earths talking point as absurd. It treats resource security like a land grab, when the real security comes from industrial capability, processing, refining, manufacturing integration. And there's another brutal reality. Mining projects do not appear in the real economy on a presidential timeline. Even in friendly jurisdictions, major mines can take close to a decade from discovery and feasibility to production. In Greenland, harsh climate, limited infrastructure, complex local politics, that timeline can stretch. That means Greenland does not solve America's near-term rare earth vulnerability, even if everything goes right. So if rare earths are truly the concern, the strategic response isn't buying Greenland. It's building domestic and allied processing capacity. That's the point. That's the lever. Now let's talk about Arctic shipping routes, because this is where the map exposes another flaw in the argument. There are multiple potential routes through the Arctic. The two that get discussed most are the Northern Sea Route and the Northwest Passage. The Northern Sea Route runs along Russia's northern coast, from the Barents Sea toward the Bering Strait. It stays largely within Russia's operational control. Russia provides icebreaker services. Russia builds ports. Russia sets conditions. If a ship wants to transit reliably, it plays by Moscow's rules. The Northwest Passage runs through Canada's Arctic archipelago. It's closer to North America, and yes, closer to Greenland's general neighborhood in parts. But it is primarily a Canada jurisdiction issue, and Canada is already a US ally. Now, here's the critical fact that wrecks the Greenland bloc's China's Arctic future narrative. China's Arctic shipping ambitions have been built primarily around cooperation with Russia and the Northern Sea Route. China calls it the Polar Silk Road. Beijing has invested politically and commercially in the Russia-linked corridor because it serves Beijing's interests. Shorter transit between Asia and Europe, and a partnership that weakens Western leverage. That route does not depend on Greenland. It doesn't run through Greenlandic waters in a way that gives Washington meaningful control, even if Greenland were magically American territory. If China is routing through Russia, Greenland is not the choke point. So when you hear, "We must acquire Greenland to stop China's Arctic shipping," you need to understand the logic error. It's like trying to buy a house near a road your competitor isn't even using. Now, does that mean Greenland is irrelevant to Arctic competition? No. Greenland still matters for surveillance, basing, undersea domain awareness, and proximity to the North Atlantic. But matters is not the same as must be owned. And this brings us to what China's actual behavior in Greenland has looked like. Beijing has shown interest in Greenland primarily through investment attempts, mining projects, infrastructure proposals, commercial footholds, not amphibious invasions, not flag planting, economic access. Some Chinese firms pursued stakes in Greenlandic mining initiatives. In some instances, those moves were blocked or neutralized not by American military threats, but by local politics. environmental regulations, and Western diplomatic pressure. Greenland has its own parliament. Greenland has its own political constraints. Greenland and Denmark operate inside a Western institutional framework that has been able to limit Chinese penetration without a territorial takeover by the United States. That's the key. The system was working. Chinese influence was being contained through normal instruments of statecraft, investment screening, diplomacy, allied coordination, and Greenland's own democratic decision-making. None of that required threatening Denmark. None of that required tariffing European allies. None of that required talk of military force. So why escalate to a strategy that burns down the alliance structure that makes containment possible in the first place? This is where we reach the paradox. The question is not, would Greenland be useful to America? It would. The question is, does Trump's method of pursuing Greenland benefit China? And here, the answer becomes uncomfortable. Because if you are sitting in Beijing watching this play out, you are not panicking. You are calculating. And there are at least 5 ways Trump's Greenland push strengthens China's position. First, alliance fracture. For decades, one of China's strategic problems has been NATO cohesion and transatlantic coordination. The US-Europe alliance is the largest combined economic and military structure in the world. It constrains China's ability to isolate countries, set global standards unopposed, and intimidate neighbors. China has tried to drive wedges between America and Europe for years, sometimes through trade, sometimes through political influence, sometimes by exploiting disagreements over Russia, technology policy, or defense burdens. Now, the United States is doing the wedge work for China. When Washington threatens tariffs on European allies to force political compliance, when it talks about coercing a NATO member's sovereign territory, when Denmark's leadership warns that an attack on Greenland would amount to the end of NATO, as we know it, you're watching transatlantic trust get shredded in real time. And trust is not a soft concept. Trust is the operating system of alliances. Once the operating system corrupts, everything becomes slower, more expensive, less coordinated, and more prone to miscalculation. That is strategic gold for Beijing. Second, strategic distraction. American attention is finite. Diplomatic bandwidth is finite. Political capital is finite. If Washington's leadership and media ecosystem are consumed by Greenland, debating acquisition, threatening allies, managing blowback, that is time not spent on what actually determines the long-term balance with China. Taiwan deterrence, semiconductor supply chain resilience, shipbuilding capacity, cyber defense, and building coalitions across the Indo-Pacific. A great power doesn't lose by being defeated in one battle. It loses by wasting energy on the wrong battles. Distraction is a weapon, and in this case, it's self-inflicted. Third, resource diversion. There are reports and estimates that acquiring Greenland could cost staggering sums, hundreds of billions of dollars, and even if the purchase price were somehow lower, development costs would be enormous. Greenland's infrastructure is sparse. Ports, roads, energy grids, housing for labor, industrial logistics in Arctic conditions, none of it is cheap. Every dollar poured into a symbolic territorial acquisition is a dollar not poured into the real contest. Building domestic rare earth separation capacity, scaling advanced manufacturing, strengthening naval readiness, and funding the industrial base that actually deters China. This is where fiscal reality bites. The United States is already running historically large deficits and carrying enormous debt. Large new expenditures don't happen in a vacuum. They crowd out. They distort priorities. They force trade-offs. And those trade-offs can weaken real capabilities. Fourth, soft power collapse. America's long-term advantage over China has never been pure coercion. It's been a combination of power and legitimacy, alliances built on consent, not intimidation, markets built on rules, security commitments that partners believed were credible, a narrative of sovereignty and international law that gave smaller nations a reason to align with Washington even if they traded with Beijing. Now imagine the optics of Washington threatening military action against Allied territory, using economic coercion to force a territorial transfer, and framing it as national security. The narrative flips. Suddenly, China can say, they claim rules matter, until they don't. Suddenly, Beijing can point to American behavior and argue the United States is no different when it wants something. That argument is not about morality, it's about persuasion. It gives fence-sitting countries political cover to hedge toward China. If America undermines the rules-based order, China benefits, because the rules-based order is one of the few things that constrains China's behavior without a war. Fifth, the Greenland independence boomerang. Greenland has been self-governing for years, with a pathway to independence through referendum. Many Greenlanders want greater autonomy. Some want full independence. But there's a difference between independence as a sovereign choice and independence as an escape from external pressure. If the United States becomes a threat rather than a partner, Greenlandic politics can harden against Western cooperation altogether. Polling and public statements from Greenland's leadership have shown strong opposition to the idea of being bought or being owned. You can't build strategic partnerships by insulting a people's sovereignty. And here's the geopolitical poison pill. When you destabilize a territory's political trajectory, you create ambiguity. And ambiguity is where foreign influence grows, not necessarily through conquest, but through investment and opportunism. If Greenland's independence pathway becomes contested and messy due to American pressure, Beijing doesn't need to take Greenland. Beijing just needs to wait for openings where a cash-strapped government seeks alternative capital. Influence doesn't require ownership, it requires access. Now step back and ask yourself what all 5 effects have in common. They are the exact objectives China would want to achieve in a long competition with the United States. Weaken NATO, distract Washington, drain resources, undermine America's legitimacy, and increase political ambiguity that creates openings for influence. And all of that can happen without China lifting a finger. This is why I said China doesn't need Greenland. China needs the West divided. China needs America distracted. China needs America's credibility discounted. China needs allies doubting whether Washington is stable. Trump's Greenland strategy delivers those outcomes at scale. Now, I want to make a crucial point, because people hear this analysis and they think it means the Arctic isn't important. That's not what I'm saying. The Arctic is strategically significant. Greenland is strategically significant. Rare earth supply chains are strategically significant. The critique is about method. There is a version of this story where the United States secures its interests in Greenland without detonating alliances. That version starts with humility and competence, not threats. The United States already has a military presence at Pituffik. That presence could be expanded through consent-based agreements with Denmark and Greenland. Surveillance capabilities can be upgraded. Joint exercises can be conducted. Arctic monitoring can be improved, all with allied cooperation. On minerals, the United States could lead a coalition to build alternative processing capacity. Not just mines, refineries, separation facilities, magnet manufacturing, the full chain. That's how you break Chinese leverage, not by waving a deed to Greenland on television. On economics, Greenland needs investment for infrastructure and development. Denmark subsidizes Greenland heavily. If Greenland wants independence, it needs a stronger economic base. The United States could help build that base through investment packages, port development, telecom, renewable energy, and sustainable resource extraction, framed as partnership, not acquisition. And on geopolitics, the United States could use NATO and Nordic partnerships to coordinate Arctic strategy, share intelligence, and deny hostile influence through positive alignment, not coercion. That approach would actually counter China. Because China's Arctic play isn't take Greenland. It's shape access and influence through Russia-linked shipping routes, commercial investment, and diplomatic narratives about Western hypocrisy. The way to counter that is not to become the hypocrisy. Now we come to the final, uncomfortable truth. If you wanted to design a policy that benefits China while claiming to counter China, you would struggle to do better than threatening to seize Greenland from a NATO ally. It fractures alliances, it erodes legitimacy, it wastes political capital, it creates dangerous precedents, it distracts from the Indo-Pacific, it tells every partner on Earth that American commitments are conditional on presidential mood. Strategy isn't about sounding tough. Strategy is about outcomes. If your stated objective is counter China, and your actual outcome is weaken NATO and discredit US leadership, then you are not countering China. You are subsidizing China's grand strategy with your own mistakes. The Greenland story matters because it exposes a deeper crisis. The United States is starting to fight 21st century competition with 19th century instincts, territory, ultimatums, coercion, spectacle. China's advantage is patience and system building, influence through contracts, infrastructure, standards, and supply chain positioning. You don't beat that with a land purchase fantasy. You beat it by building coalitions, rebuilding industrial capacity, and behaving like a reliable partner. So watch what happens next. Not just the rhetoric. Watch the alliance reactions. Watch the tariff threats. Watch whether Washington pivots toward partnership and processing capacity or doubles down on coercion and symbolism. Because the paradox is now on the table, and it's the one nobody wants to say out loud, the harder America pushes for Greenland to stop China, the more China may be winning.